Phew, what a week it's been for the governing party, the ANC. One court today dismissing Party Secretary General Ace Magashula's bid to nullify his suspension from the ANC. On the same day, another court rejecting former ANC President Jacob Zuma's application to stay out of prison until his constitutional court hearing next week. Now, is the unfolding drama a welcome gift to ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa and those family behind him? And if indeed it is, what's in it for the country beyond party factional interests? Analyst Ibrahim Fakir and Dr. Stembile Mbete are on standby for that conversation. Today's court ruling, of course, coming as it did in the same week that the ANC's NEC released perhaps its most assertive statement in as many years, affirming their, quote, unequivocal commitment to and defense of the Constitution, in particular the supremacy of the Constitution, the rule of law, and the independence of the judiciary, unquote. Well, ANC Deputy Secretary General Jesse Duarte adding that the ANC NEC has also had enough of the so-called radical economic transformation cohort, some of whom are hell-bent on distorting the party's conference resolutions on economic transformation for the sole aim of winning the hearts and minds of especially young people. Take a listen to what Jesse Duarte said on Tuesday.
The ANC resolution, if one explains it to people, we have no choice but to embark on a process of radically transforming the structure of our economy. But at the same time, you cannot radically restructure the economy without social reconstruction of what is taking place on the ground in our country. And the two are inextricably bound together. It is precisely at the core of our economic recovery plan that we must have an economy that works for all the people of South Africa. You can't have an economy that is one-sided. Our economy has not grown for a while. And it's not just about 2008. It is it's been a long-moving trajectory of limited growth for various factors. And I think at another meeting with yourselves, we'd be very happy for Enoch Godongwana to come and explain where we're going and the direction we're taking.
Well, Enoch Godongwana is here. He is our first guest. The Watchdog starts now. Well, let's speak to him, Enoch Godongwana, who is the chairperson of the ANC's Committee on Economic Transformation. Good evening, Mr. Godongwana. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Good evening, Vuyo and SABC listeners.
Now, take us through some of the things that perhaps gave the National Executive Committee of the ANC a sense that the resolutions around economic transformations continue to be exploited for reasons other than what the conversations that went on at Nasrec and the subsequent resolutions that were adopted were meant to do. What has been happening that really that told the NEC that it's time to act against those who are distorting the conference resolutions?
I think the ANC's agenda of radical economic transformation is not a new concept. There are others who think that it's an invention of a Nasrec conference in 2017. It has always been the agenda of the African National Congress, outlined in the Freedom Charter, contained in more elaborated in the Ready to Govern document. So that has always been the agenda of the ANC. In Nasrec, there were a couple of resolutions which are couched with that formulation. Mm-hmm. They themselves are not necessarily a problem. So what is a problem? The problem is not radical economic transformation or the radical economic transformation agenda. What is the problem are people who have constituted themselves into what is called radical economic transformation forces. That is what the ANC is dealing with and begin to say is an anomaly in how we function as an organization.
What have they been doing, especially in the recent past, to warrant the attention they are now being that this issue or phenomenon is now being given?
They've been trying to distort a number of the resolutions of the ANC in a number of ways, and they themselves have constituted into this organization, which has created a different agenda of its own. That is what the ANC is rejecting. And I must come back and say radical economic transformation agenda is an ANC agenda.
Now, let's talk a couple of specifics, because as you heard Jesse Duarte saying, the economy is not performing. The coronavirus pandemic has only made worse a situation that was already bad, actually very, very bad. Now, how do we get out of the situation that we're in now? What are the marching orders that the ANC has given or is giving its cadres who are in government?
Let me say, we faced difficulties, some of them not of our own choosing. The economy was performing perfectly well until the global financial crisis in 2008, which had a serious impact, and we had lost about, if I'm not mistaken now, about 2 million jobs. We began to pick up in the third quarter of 2010. However, for our own mistakes, two things have had a serious impact on the growth performance. The first one is the electricity challenge, which we've had since 2008, which is impacting negatively on growth. And secondly, there's been a huge impact of corruption on the performance of the economy, including state-owned enterprises. Some of those things have kind of derailed the progress. Coupled with that, then, was the downgrading, which came just before the coronavirus. That on its own poses a challenge of increasing borrowing cost for the economy. Then the pandemic came in and just exacerbated the problem. So the challenge is, how do we manage ourselves out of that crisis? And it's an issue we're grappling with. Last year, we produced a document in July, which was focusing on reconstruction, growth, and transformation, building a new inclusive economy. And in it, we outlined a couple of elements which would impact on growth. A key aspect of that was going back to the RDP in a sense, because the fault lines of which have been thrown out by the coronavirus are such that we've not invested in some of the basic needs, which are critical even during this phase of the pandemic. And then part of that is investing in that infrastructure.
Now, let's start with the electricity crisis. Interesting, a week ago, I went back to the book that the late Professor Kada Asmal wrote, essentially documenting his life. And somewhere buried inside that book is what Professor Asmal observed happened back in the day. This is the first term of former President Thabo Mbeki's government, where he said reports were tabled before cabinet, warning about the crisis that we are finding ourselves in now, with Eskom not being able to really satisfy the country's needs, and how these reports were repeatedly ignored, and of course the rest, as people say, is history. Fast forward to where things are now with the turnaround that Eskom has embarked upon. Are you satisfied as the ANC that it is now on the right path? If you look at, for example, things like by how much they have now begun to reduce their debt, for example. If you look also at other things that are coming on stream, whether it's your power ships with all the controversies surrounding that, or whether it's the ability of private sector people to generate up to 100 megawatts. Are you satisfied as the ANC that we are on the right path?
Just before dealing with that question, let me go back to 1998, because we need to, there are different interpretations of what Professor Akada Asmal is saying. My understanding of what transpired in 1998 was that within the white paper, it was argued that there must be a split in the generation space between the public sector in the form of Eskom and the private sector. And that split must be 70% Eskom and 30% the private sector. What then transpired was that government did not create a regulatory framework for the private sector to develop the 30% required. It's not that people were not, reports were not attended to. It was a regulatory framework which will assist private sector participation, which we have managed to create since 2010. Coming back to your critical question, where are we? I think the analysis that we have at the moment is that given Eskom's balance sheet and its challenges, there was an introduction of private sector participation in the generation space, beginning from 2020 in the form of IPPs. So the shift is not only to say, let's fix Eskom. The shift is saying, well, fixing Eskom, fix also security of supply. That's where the debate is at the moment. And you'll see that a lot of interventions are being made. For instance, the recent announcement by the president of the 100 megawatts for embedded generation are part of those interventions of dealing with the gap.
Let's get to the second issue that you're raising, which is the issue of corruption. The court cases I spoke about earlier, of course, have a lot to do with that. But issues like, the ANC's ability to, pay its own bills are a big factor. One of the things, or among the things that have come through, is the fact that the ANC has to go back to business people who in turn want tenders from the state to be able to sustain itself. Now, what are you doing as the ANC to make sure that you close that gap as well? Because it is a big factor, because the people who give you money as an organization when you run out of funds to be able to pay your staff, have an expectation that down the line, they will get tenders through people you've deployed in government, so that they can then be able to, get back the money that they would have given you.
Let me say, that's not part of my terrain in the ANC, but for the benefit of the public, I must not seem to be ducking the question. There are people who are dealing with that question. My understanding, in the manner, the way they are dealing with this question, they are taking into account the changing environment. For instance, the Constitutional Court has made a ruling that there must be a disclosure of political party funding. That in itself has got implication in terms of those funders who would not like to be seen publicly funding the ANC. That is going to create a challenge for the resources for the ANC. And there's a team led by the Treasurer General, which is trying to streamline the ANC kind of cost structure so that the ANC must be able to survive moving forward. There are details which that team is working on.
But how important, from what you are hearing, how important is the issue of the ANC's own ability to sustain itself, to pay its bills, so as to decrease, if not eliminate completely, dependence on a private sector, people who obviously have expectations?
To my knowledge, no party, to my knowledge, even in developed economies that are not funded, raising funds from the private sector. I think the ANC will continue to raise funding from those who would be willing to be disclosed in the public domain. I think that's I suspect all other parties are in a similar space as us.
Also important, of course, is the issue of ensuring that you deal with those who are found to be corrupt within your ranks, which is what some of the court cases we're talking about now are, of course, about. I'm sure you would have seen or heard your suspended Secretary General crying foul, saying, he is being targeted here because this rule doesn't seem to apply equally to everybody.
I think our message is clear, although this is not, again, the subject of my coming here. Our message is clear, and I think Judge Kolopen's judgment summarized for the public what the steps the ANC has been taking over the past few years to grapple with this question. And in particular, reaching the climax in August last year when we drew a line on the sand and said people that are being charged for corruption will be dealt with in terms of the procedures of the ANC, and those procedures have been found to be valid. But as I'm saying, my focus is in the ANC is largely on the economic policy front.
Mm-hmm. Now, among the things, of course, the private sector, which you're going to need as a government, was the governing party going forward. For us to get out of the quagmire that we're in now. They've pointed to a lot of things that, of course, the documents you referred to earlier speak to as well. The issue of policy inconsistencies, for example. The issue, how are you dealing with that specific one? Are you satisfied now that going forward there won't be situations like we found in mining, for example, where the one day this gets said and then the next day the policy people experience, or players in that space feel that the policy gets chopped and changed all the time depending on who is in charge in the executive at that particular point in time?
To my knowledge, even in mining, there's convergence between the Chamber of Mines and the Department of Mineral Resources in terms of work. I do not know of any policy inconsistency at the moment. By the way, one of the things with the document we produced last year and the document business produced, there were even business agreed that there were a lot of areas of agreement. What, in my view, is going to be necessary is for government in NEDLEC to begin to enter into serious discussion, both with business and labor, and in terms of developing concrete plans for the intervention moving forward.
Well, when I was talking about policy inconsistencies, I meant before the current minister arrived, the one who was before him had a different take on things, and that, I think, is where the problem came in. And I was watching, incidentally, about 2 weeks ago, a conversation between people who were involved in mining, where they were actually singing Gwede Mandashe's praises, but at the same time pointing out, for example, that they are not getting the same level of cooperation when it comes to policing, for example, where communities invade, certain mines and start demanding stakes and so on. They are not receiving the same cooperation from the people responsible for water affairs, for example, when they are starting with new projects and so on. Is this something that preoccupies your committee, as much as it preoccupies the business people who actually do want to invest or who want, to see their investments bearing fruit?
Of course it should. Of course it should, because it impacts negatively on the economy. Let me give you an example. The organization which is organizing the construction industry, forgot its name now, they gave a figure of about more than 10 billion rand construction projects that were stopped as a result of people rocking up and demanding shareholding. That in itself, that amount of construction work which has been stopped is definitely unacceptable. It impacts on growth. So crime is a serious issue for us as a committee.
Now, assuming then, Mr. Godongwana, that this tendency of the RET forces, that what's happening or is beginning to happen now, whether it's the court cases, those found to have broken the law being brought to book, irrespective of who you are or who you may have been in the ANC before, assuming that things go as they are going, so you then, you remain focused as the ANC on the things that you need to do. How do you think society needs to come on board? Because it's easy. I know that at NEDLEC, there is civil society in addition to business and labor that government has to work with. But I think there seems to be a lack. Even though you are the leader of society, as you call yourselves, there seems to be an inability to actually carry society with you throughout. How are you going to rectify that particular problem?
I'm not just saying we're not interacting and interfacing as we should with civil society. That I can accept. And it's a matter that we're looking at seriously. And because it is important that we must do so. But we're moving from a position where there has been a trust deficit. So as part of that, we need to move and close that gap and develop trust between ourselves and civil society. Because a transformation of this economy is not going to succeed with the ANC alone or government alone. We need society to move with us in the same direction.
What are the building blocks? What are you going to use as building blocks? If the gap has yawned by as much as you are describing it, so how are you going to even begin to close that gap? What are you going to use?
Let me say it's easier at government level and more complex at our level as ANC. At government level, it's easier because there are institutions through which government can stimulate dialogue. For instance, there's NEDLEC. And beyond NEDLEC, there are individual federations and individual unions. There are individual chamber of commerces like CIFSA, the Chamber Mineral Council of South Africa, and the rest. So from a government perspective, you've got a wide range of institutions that you can mobilize around a common vision. From the ANC perspective, it's in a difficult environment because political parties, although you're supposed to be patrons and working towards a common goal, you are also competitors. So that's the first challenge you have. The second challenge is that the whole range of a number of organizations in civil society. How does one plug into them? There's a broad also number of academics who may want to contribute in the economic sphere. How many of them, how do you interact with them? So those are kind of challenges that from an ANC perspective, whereas from a government perspective, that is easy. That's why for where we sit, we normally draw a broad vision as the ANC in terms of parameters and policy parameters and expect government to craft the details and the plans.
How much of a stumbling block or how much of a problem do you think the fact that you are in alliance with certain groupings, in this case COSATU and to a lesser extent the SACP, how much of that is going to be a problem? And I'm asking this because there are other, for instance, trade union federations that aren't necessarily, that are not in alliance with you. Have you given that any particular thought?
No, we talked to a number of these federations. I talked to Vavi, I talked to Neras Mloto in NACTU. I'm just giving you an example. Well, we respect the protocols between ourselves and COSATU and our alliance partners. When it comes to consulting on broad issues which go beyond our own alliance, there's nothing that stops us from doing so.
And what about political parties, especially those that are in parliament? If you look at the whole question of land, for example, right now, where people thought there was a strategic donathering between you and the EFF, for example, that seems to be falling apart. Have you been able to give any thought to how you manage your relations with other parties in Parliament so that whatever program you come up with beyond this point has a buy-in from significant sections of the opposition?
Yeah, I've not been to much in Parliament, so I don't understand fully the parliamentary operations, which I defer to the chief whip on these matters. However, I do know that at parliamentary level there has been an interaction between the EFF and like-minded parties on the amendment of Section 25. I know that there has been some interaction between the Deputy Secretary General of the ANC and the Secretary General of the EFF. The outcome of those discussions, I don't know. Maybe they will come up in the National Executive Committee.
Mr. Kodongwana, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much for speaking to us this evening. He is, of course, the chairperson of the ANC's Committee on Economic Transformation. Now, as many of you would know, the court today dismissed Party Secretary General Ace Magashule's bid to nullify his suspension. On the same day, another court rejected former ANC President Jacob Zuma's application to stay out of prison until his constitutional court hearing next week. The question we are asking this evening is whether the unfolding drama is a welcome gift to ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa and those firmly behind it. And if indeed that is the case, what's in it for the country beyond party factional interests? Analysts Ibrahim Fakir and Dr. Stembile Mbete are on standby to speak to those questions. This is the Watchdog. Welcome back. We're now joined by analysts Ibrahim Fakir and Stembile Mbete. Good evening to both of you. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Let me start with you, Dr. Mbete. Just your take. The events of the past week have given us a lot of work. Just what you make of it all.
Look, I think this has been quite a momentous time for our democracy in a number of ways. Firstly, this real stress testing almost of our institutions, particularly our law enforcement institutions, by this, firstly, the bid to appeal the sentence that was handed down to former President Zuma, and then the impending deadline for his arrest, and then his eventual arrest at the last hour on Wednesday night. And I think that and then, of course, what we've seen in the past 2 days, and especially today, of those protests in KwaZulu-Natal, and then what we're waiting for on Monday with the Constitutional Court's judgment on the rescission application. And I think that what we've seen is a number of our institutions kind of being tested to their limit. And so far, I think that we've seen institutionalism and constitutionalism prevail, but certainly the story isn't over yet. And I think there are many people who are looking to challenge the outcomes of this week's various event, whether through the legal institutions or through extra institutional means.
Ibrahim, what do you make of the events of the past week?
Absolutely. I think, I don't differ significantly with Dr. Mbete, but I do think that our institutions, while they've prevailed at this moment, are by no means completely entrenched, firstly. Secondly, I think the hyperbole that some people are trotting about around the entrenchment of the rule of law may be a little bit premature. I would certainly concede that the rule of law is traveling further along the path where it might have been a little while ago. That's certainly the case. So it's a moment of encouragement. It's certainly a moment of succor for most of us who've been involved in trying to build the institutions over time. But there's still obviously lots of stress testing to be remained, and that will remain both procedurally. And remember, the ANC at the helm of the state has enabled and facilitated the manipulation of institutions, the manipulation of processes, and so on. So it's by no means over, firstly, on that score, just on the institutional procedural front. On the political front, of course, now, some people are incentivized to continue saber-rattling, no matter how much we think the saber-rattling is faux radical. The reality is that it's going to happen. And it will happen. And it can have pockets of destabilization in society. Now, of course, those who believe in the cult of personality overplayed their hand. I think they thought that they'd be able to sell this idea that we can find a negotiated way out of this, right? And we don't need an objective marker of what is just. We can negotiate our way out of this if we threaten enough instability. And I think they've been proven wrong, that the cultists of all political persuasions don't actually find fertile ground in society. But the threat of pockets of instability, I think, still remains on the political front.
Well, Dr. Mbete, the theory, or one of the things that the protesters or the people who've seen protesting, whether it's today or over the past week, they are saying that they're alleging that state institutions are being used to fight factional ANC battles. And we're seeing that, we've been hearing that for years, but the noises are getting louder and louder now that things are beginning to happen to very specific people.
Well, I think that what was very important about the judgment that was delivered by the Constitutional Court, the majority judgment that was delivered, was the extent to which the court spoke about what was happening as a fight between the court and Mr. Zuma himself, that it was about maintaining the integrity of the court, maintaining the legitimacy of the court in the face of the threats that they were receiving, or that they perceived themselves to be receiving from President Zuma. So the court itself really has portrayed this as a fight between the institutions and political forces that are trying to undermine those institutions. And I think that is somewhat different to some of the other political cases that we've seen. Certainly, former President Zuma's own his own court cases in the previous 10 to 15 years. I also think that the fact that we haven't heard anything from President Ramaphosa is significant and is important because as the head of state and the head of government, he is really kept out of these of this case between former President Zuma and the law enforcement agencies. And I think that is important in terms of maintaining the separation of powers.
Ibrahim Fakir, whether he keeps out, of these court cases, as Dr. Mbete says, the net effect, of what we are seeing is that it does strengthen his hand, doesn't it? Certainly within the ANC.
Absolutely, it strengthens his hand. There's no doubt about that, because the institutions and the rule of law and the rules by law are coming down on his side. But I'm somewhat discomforted, to be perfectly honest, and I think Dr. Mbete would probably share the sentiment, I don't know. But I'm discomforted with this idea that we're positing Zuma against Ramaphosa and Ramaphosa against Zuma. And it's an important and telling point that she's made, that he's kept out. Now, it's worth pausing there for a moment and elaborating why it's important that he kept out. Because remember, Mr. Zuma and his supporters keep proffering that this is some kind of factional issue in the party. And Dr. Mbete is pointing out that actually the court was clear in making this about the assault on institutions and processes and procedures by a particular political faction. It doesn't say which faction. Now, for a sitting president of both the head of the country and of the party to be seen to be saying something, perhaps as head of state may be necessary, but as head of party, absolutely not, because that gives credence to the idea that this is in fact politically factional, and it's not, which is why I'm slightly discomforted by it. Now, of course, the one side would like to pretend that it is politically factional because it suits their purposes. But in reality, it's not. How can it be factional if this party facilitated and enabled this guy's ability to assault institutions, manipulate processes, undermine procedures? How is that factional? Where was this rest of the faction at that time? They were serving with him, one as his deputy. That's point number one. Point number two is that if this were really factional, they know that having been at the helm of the state, President Zuma knows that actually it's not within Ramaphosa's ambit to be able to do anything, to stay a prosecution or to motivate a prosecution. Those decisions are independently taken. Where there may be issues is that there may be political factions, ideological, sure, but the ideological factions are not necessarily at play now in terms of the way in which the institutions are being pitted and the rules are being pitted against each other. The point that has been made amply is the fact that, look, institutions were manipulated, procedures were manipulated, they were manipulated for a particular malevolent purpose of state capture. So it's not ordinary state capture, which democracy actually facilitates. This was malevolent and has bad effects in society. Those were done for a particular purpose and a particular political outcome. And it's not saying that that political outcome is where the court wants to involve itself by choosing a side of one or other faction. So I think we should get away as a society from viewing this merely in factional terms, even though, yes, it's true. President Ramaphosa is infinitely strengthened, both in the party and in the state. The question, though, is for how long?
But infinitely strengthened, Dr. Mbete, as Ibrahim says. How then does the president use the gains that he's got? Yes, they may not be of his own making. In other words, he would not have had gone to the courts to say, rule against this guy so that I can put him in his place, right? But, he stands to benefit handsomely. How does he use that to the benefit of the country, and perhaps without necessarily being triumphalist? But how does he use the opportunities that these court cases and the commissions of inquiry and everything are actually delivering to him?
Well, before I answer that question, I just also want to point out, just building on what Ibrahim has said, that let's remember that former President Zuma is in jail for contempt of court. he was not imprisoned around the substantive matters of the allegations of state capture. He wasn't imprisoned for any substantive matter. It is around the issue of being in contempt of an order of the Constitutional Court. And I think that is important to help us place this in its correct proportion, because there are going to be a number of other cases that former President Zuma is going to be facing around far more substantive issues and around far more substantive political issues than what we are seeing now. So I think that is a caution around reading too much politically into the events that we have seen. However, having said that, I do think that what we have seen in this past week, and the fact that whilst there has been, as Ibrahim has said, many pockets of violence, protest that we've seen in KwaZulu-Natal, we haven't seen the kind of groundswell of support for former President Zuma that has often been threatened before. And what we've seen certainly is that many of the provincial structures of the ANC have been pretty supportive, actually, of the statements that have been made by the national structures. And so it seems that President Ramaphosa and his current agenda of reform seems to have sufficient support within the party structures, and that can be used by him as leverage for some of his bigger or grander reform efforts within the state, and to further consolidate his power and control over the national structures. But of course, we know that week, a month, a year in politics is a long time, and there could be all sorts of shifts in the coming year and a half before the next elective conference in December of 2022. But certainly at this point, President Ramaphosa seems to have a solid hold over his party. The big question, of course, is whether he'll be able to convert that into exerting greater control and influence over the state. And so that means the cabinet reshuffle that we've all been waiting for months and months, where they'll be able to use it to exert any policy influence over the state to a greater extent. Those are still question marks that I think we'll only really be able to answer in the coming months.
Of course, as soon as the COVID pandemic is over, the ANC will be going to a policy conference, Ibrahim Fakir, and we all know that that's where these things play themselves out, and it doesn't matter whether you are a good president, everyone, I mean, people are happy with you. The factional battles are going to come out all over again, and it could be very, very messy.
Of course it's going to be messy, but it's always messy. It's always messy. It's, politics never clean. It's never been clean in that clear-cut way in the ANC. But that's not necessarily a bad thing for you. I mean, if you want proper policy refinement and ideological approaches, then this is the kind of debates that you have to countenance, and you have to expect them and accept them. The tragedy in our case was that these debates, necessary as they are, were used as a proxy to mask other kinds of behavior and then pretend as if that was in fact about policy or an ideological posture, when in fact it was not. So that's been the tragedy of our case. Now, yes, you're right, it plays itself out in that way factionally. People will group and align around it. The unfortunate trend that national general councils have been, and this has been the early indicator for people who are watching it, is that depending on who sponsors which type of resolution and whoever lines up behind them, has more or less been a clear indicator of who or which faction or which person will prevail. So then policy debates start being used as a proxy for individuals. So there are two kinds of proxy things going on. One is that ideological debate is being used to mask some other avaricious and acquisitive behavior or predatory behavior, if you want to be blunt. On the one hand, on the other hand, policy proposals are lined up behind by people or branches and factions, depending on which ones they support or which individuals support. Sometimes you'll find even the curious absurdity of people lining up behind a policy position that they aren't necessarily convinced of, but they like the person, so they're going to line up behind that. Now, what you're going to see happening now is all kinds of fluid shifts going on. People who you wouldn't expect, and we've seen this now in the past couple of weeks, people who you wouldn't expect to be friends with some politicians are in fact firmly in their pockets. And this kind of thing is actually debilitating for society, because you don't know what kind of politics people are pursuing and for what purpose. That's a problem. And just quickly, I want to return to the question that you asked, Timbile. That is that, how does President Ramaphosa leverage this power? Well, if he wants to leverage the power, even going to the NGC, to your question, he must simply use the rules and the authority which is imbued to him as the head of state, and forget the ANC party politics. To the extent that ANC party politics are debilitating his ability to administer and execute policy in the state, he has to bite the bullet now and ride roughshod over them, irrespective of what the consequences might be. South Africa is at the point where the president, as the head of state and as the head of the ruling party, has to choose the country, has to choose the society, and wait to solve political problems in the ANC for later.
And Sembile, I mean, it's what Ibrahim has articulated so well. It's important for us to be alive to this. And if we cast our minds back to the, policy conference at Tuks, which was the precursor to Polokwane, you look at the group of people that rallied behind former President Jacob Zuma. It was a disparate group. They had, some of the people who were threw their lot behind Jacob Zuma had nothing. In fact, some of them didn't even like him. But they did, throw their weight behind him, because it's a numbers game. At the end of the day, they did what they managed to do in Polokwane. And it's important for us as South Africans to be alive to these ANC dynamics, because at the end of the day, it's what gives us what we deserve or don't deserve.
Indeed, and I think that in many ways, the interests and the good of the country is sometimes held ransom, actually, by the machinations of the ANC as the ruling party, and where then the people that govern are far more concerned with the dynamics going on within the ruling party than in the reality of life and hardship that the majority of South Africans face. And I think that the point that Ibrahim makes about President Ramaphosa needing to choose the good of the country over the good of the party, I think is very important. Let's not forget that we are sitting with an over 70% youth unemployment rate. We are sitting with many businesses, small businesses that have collapsed because as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're seeing the reality of small towns all over the country that have just collapsed under poor governance and economic flight from those areas. And those are massive problems that really come to the heart of whether or not there'll be a state even to govern, or a state to loot from, for that matter, by those that are only interested in politics for the purpose of looting. And so there is a need, I think, for President Ramaphosa to be seen to be taking the problems of the country more seriously than is currently evident in the discourse.
Quick one, Ibrahim. Assuming that indeed, the issue of a cabinet reshuffle is among the items that are top of the list of the president's to-do list. Do you think he has an appetite for that? Yes, there are vacancies for a fact, but do you think he has an appetite for that?
Look, historically, Vuyo, you've been doing this long enough, and you know that everyone who speculates about cabinet reshuffles inevitably gets it wrong. Now, I don't think you want me to join that not-so-exclusive club. And I'm not prepared to go there. But look, politically, structurally, it's time for cabinet reshuffle. The president should make a reshuffle, not in mind, again, to pick up from Stembile, of what is going to work for which faction in the ANC, which strengthens him going to the NGC and so on. Those are calculations, sure, everyone's interested in, and they matter. But we've got to take a long, hard look at ourselves now. Societies which have robust institutions can withstand malevolent politics for a period. Ours cannot. We've gone through a transition. We're going through a transformation. We need deep structural transformation. The kind of problems we've got now, the president has to make a cabinet reshuffle based on meeting the goals and objectives of development in the shortest term. Beyond that, he can start thinking about political calculations. Right now, the urgency is a cabinet reshuffle to fill vacancies for people to cover portfolios which require delivery on social welfare, on transformation, on reducing austerity, stimulating the economy massively. We do need a massive stimulus. And that stimulus has to come from the economic sector. It has to come from some top-up welfare transfer. We cannot continue the way we have to. It is inhumane. And so the health department, the health ministry needs some solution very quickly. So that's the kind of reshuffling calculus he's got to engage in, not the kind of calculus that people assume, what works for me and what works for which faction. That's not the calculus that's needed.
Quick last word from you, Stembile. What should he be doing now? Or what should preoccupy his mind?
Stimulating the economy. That should occupy his mind, and the millions of young people who are unemployed. That should be his prime. I mean, it would be a crisis anywhere else in the world. A government should be thinking of nothing else but how to get us out of this crisis. And if he wants to have any political sustainability, this should be what he thinks about and stays awake all night about every day until it's resolved.
And that's where we're going to leave it.
Absolutely.
Yes,
his own longevity and the longevity of the ANC depend on him making the right calculations now.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks to both of you, Dr. Stembile Mbete and Ibrahim Fakir. And that's all we had time for this evening. Enjoy your weekend, and do join us again on Monday, same time, 8 p.m. sharp. Have a good night and a great weekend.